As we read the churches in the New Testament, we look for the instructions that were given to them and the things that they did, and to imitate the things that were taught to them from the apostles. In Acts chapter 14, as Paul had been away from the church in Antioch, throughout the middle of the book of Acts, he often came back to that congregation. And this is one of those occasions. He sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had completed. Goes back to Acts chapter 13. Now, when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them, and that He had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And so some unique opportunities that Paul and Barnabas had while they traveled from place to place. And so on their return, because the church was in Antioch was so involved in the work that Paul and Barnabas had been sent out to do, then as he returned, he offered some summary of the time and the work that he had spent away. I don't always do that, and obviously if I just go visit family, then that's of a different sort, but the time that we spent away was primarily because of some opportunities related to my work as an evangelist. So I wanted to do something similar to what Paul did, and offer some report of the time that we spent, especially in Tucson last week. But don't worry, it's not family pictures at the Grand Canyon, but focused on the nature of some of those opportunities that you share in, and that the church there also shares in. Turn to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians 4, verse 11 and 12, we are reminded that God is working when evangelists are working and when churches are working, and then when they combine their efforts, when evangelists and churches are working together, then that is credited to God, because whose idea was it that there would be someone called an evangelist? And whose idea was it that there would be these groups of people who were called the churches that belong to Jesus Christ? Well, of course, all of that originates with Him. In Ephesians 4, beginning in verse 11, notice that He Himself gave apostles, some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. Everything in this verse, it begins by pointing out they originated with Jesus. There would have been no apostles if Jesus had not appointed some to be apostles. There would be no prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. And then notice verse 12, there of course would be no saints if it were not something that Jesus gave and provided for. These workers in verses 11 and 12 are not of course all present in body today. There are no apostles, there are no living prophets today. But when he mentions evangelists, pastors, and teachers, at least in part, that's a reflection of God's plan for the local church. The local church is always made up of saints, and then if there can be overseers, those who do the work of shepherding, watching the flock, if there can be evangelists available who can do that work, well then as they work together, who gets the ultimate credit for what they're doing and for what is accomplished? Well, it was God's idea to begin with, so of course He does. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, we get a little bit of insight into some of the details of the nature of churches and evangelists working together. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, read verses 10 through 12 and then drop down to verse 17. And what I want you to notice is what Paul says about some who would come and go, and all who are involved in those kinds of decisions. So beginning in verse 10, he says, And if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear, for he does the work of the Lord as I do. Therefore let no one despise him, but send him on his journey in peace, that he may come to me, for I am waiting for him with the brethren. Now concerning our brother Apollos, remember Apollos from Acts chapter 18 with Aquila and Priscilla. I strongly urged him to come to you with the brethren, but he was quite unwilling to come at this time. However, he will come when he has a convenient time. Notice mixed in this, Timothy is possibly going to come, and then Paul says, then send him on his way at the appropriate time. Apollos has decided not to come, but then he might come later. Though it's simple, notice that in this case, Timothy the evangelist, Apollos the evangelist, and then Paul, of course, not only was an apostle, but his work was also the same as that of an evangelist, that each evangelist could decide whether to go to a particular place. But then Paul is also giving the church in Corinth some choice here about whether they would receive or invite someone to come. And so that's the nature of the work that God has arranged for evangelists and churches. Each have a say in whether someone comes. The evangelist has a part, and whether a part in that decision, and the church has a part in that decision. And then go up in the same chapter to verses 7 and 8. Paul says, I do not wish to see you now on the way, but I hope to stay a while with you, if the Lord permits, but I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost. Whether an evangelist comes is in part his decision. Whether he's invited to come is the congregation's decision. But then what about staying? I don't know if you've heard, there are some Christians who have a conscience, some who go beyond that and make it a test of fellowship, about a preacher staying at a congregation. Some say, well, an evangelist isn't supposed to stay, he's got to always be moving. But notice here, Paul had some say in that as far as his choice. He says, well, I want to come and remain with you. But he says, for now, I want to remain in Ephesus. So he had some part in that. But then also the congregation can have some part and say in an evangelist's remaining or not. Go in Acts chapter 13, referenced earlier, Paul had been in Antioch. He and Barnabas had stayed for a while, but then there was a time where they decided not to go, and the church was they decided to go, and the church was in agreement with that. The church sent him on his way. And so whether an evangelist is coming, remaining, or going, well, he has some decision in that. And then the church has some decision in that process. And so when an evangelist makes those decisions, when the church is making those decisions, well, they need to be thinking about, well, what's God's part in that? What has God said that helps us to work through those decisions? Another part of that relationship in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul says a lot just in these few verses, and gives us some insight into how some of those details were worked out. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 8, when some were criticizing Paul because he chose not to accept wages from the church at Corinth, he says, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. Notice Paul uses the word wage, which emphasizes that he deserved to receive the things that he was given, even though Corinth offered to share with him. So it's obvious they had the funds to do so. But he said, I'm not going to take any from you. There are others who are willing to share, and so he accepted that from them. So he preferred his wages come from other sources. And so that's clearly his option. And then the congregation, they had the choice to offer it as well. So this is another part where the nature of the church and the evangelist working together. And Paul describes their work together, whether it's the church he's with or the church in other places. He describes what is shared as wages. But then go to Philippians chapter 4, because it's really the same subject here, but he doesn't use the word wages. Philippians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. And it's worth noticing in 2 Corinthians 11, he mentioned other churches, and those were the churches of Macedonia, and that could include Philippi and Thessalonica. They're all in the same region. So beginning of verse 16, Paul says, "For even in Thessalonica you sent aid once and again for my necessities, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account." So notice what he called in Corinth, what he called wages. In this place, he calls it a gift. And that once I noticed that, I don't know who called that to my attention, but there's not very many things in life that are both a wage and a gift. When you've worked 40 hours or however many at your job, you didn't get a gift. That was wages. That was something that you earned. But if you, on the day that you were born, and in the years after that, if someone gave you a gift to show that they're rejoicing for another year of life, well, that wasn't something that you earned. That was a gift. There's not very many things that I can think of or occasions where something we are given is both a wage and a gift. It's usually one or the other in every case I can think of, except in this case, where Paul calls what was shared with him both a wage and a gift. And so in Philippi, they didn't view what they were sharing with him as a business transaction, as an exchange of services for pay. They did not only participate with them if it was beneficial to them. It wasn't that kind of an investment. They knew the work that Paul was doing, and so wherever he was, they were willing to share in that according to their ability. And Paul says that the result of that, the result of the gift they provided, meant that they received fruit as a result. The fruit that came, he says, God credited that to your account, but he isn't talking about when he was teaching the Philippian jailer or Lydia or the other things that happened in Philippi. He's saying when I was in other places, the work that was done there, God viewed that as a reflection of you. Even though the church in Philippi wasn't growing in number, while he was in Athens or in Corinth or in these other places. I don't know how often to express my gratitude to you for the opportunities that you give me to work here, and then on rare occasion in other places. And there are wage aspects to it, but I hope this helps to shape the work that we do together in our minds as not merely a business transaction, but as Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. That emphasizes the gift aspect. And so I appreciate what you provide in the wages and the gift and the time that allows me to do this work. That's another reason I wanted to spend a few minutes in our study this morning to share some of the details about the recent trip, because any good that was accomplished, though you don't know as a whole the people that we were able to meet and work with, if there was anything that was good that was accomplished, then according to what Paul says, then God credits the church here for providing me those kinds of opportunities. And so you share in fruit that maybe even you were not aware of. Who gets the credit when someone goes or stays or doesn't? The point is, by the language of Luke in Acts chapter 14, God is working. Paul describes what God had done among them. And so when evangelists and churches are working together because those are God's idea, then we can say that God is working on those occasions. God is also working when His churches work together. Go back in the book of Acts. There are several occasions where we see churches cooperating, working together. I want to look at a few examples of that. Look at Acts chapter 11. Acts chapter 11, it's clear in the book of Acts that churches were aware of other churches. They were interested in each other, attentive to each other within proper boundaries, and even communicated with each other in one way or another. Acts chapter 11, notice in verse 22, after Luke describes the gospel that had spread from Jerusalem, it had come to Antioch, primarily a Gentile area. And so the news of those things came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem. and they sent out Barnabas to go as far as Antioch. There's a lot that happened with that word "and." They heard about the gospel spreading to Antioch, and then they were interested in it, and then they had this man Barnabas among them. We know about his generosity in Acts chapter 4, but we learn in the book of Acts also that he's a talented teacher. And so the church in Jerusalem, just as we noted earlier, someone had the idea, whether Barnabas volunteered himself, "Hey, I'll go and help them," or whether someone said, "Hey, Barnabas, it sounds like the work that is happening is something that would fit your interest and your abilities. Barnabas, would you consider going up to Antioch, or going as far as Antioch?" Somehow they worked together in making that decision. But also here we have Jerusalem and Antioch aware of and interested in the work that was happening among each other. Then go over to Acts chapter 13, and whether it was because of the influence of Jerusalem, or whether it was just because they were spiritually minded anyway. In Acts chapter 13, we see in verses 1 and 2 that there's Paul and Barnabas, but there are other prophets, there are other teachers there. And then the Holy Spirit sends a direct message in verse 2 that Paul and Barnabas were to go elsewhere. But think about being a member in Antioch. Wouldn't every church love to have a Paul and a Barnabas, based on everything that you know about those two? But the church in Antioch didn't say, "Well, how about could we trade out one of our other prophets and teachers?" Verse 3, having fasted and prayed and laid hands on them, they sent them away. The church was involved in sending Paul and Barnabas on their way to do this work. So here, Jerusalem and Antioch, and then the church in Antioch in sending Paul out. My point is that churches are even interested in one another, working together to send teachers as needed, or to provide aid and help for evangelists as that was needed. Go over to Acts chapter 15. Acts chapter 15. So this follows what we read a few minutes ago. Paul now has come, and Barnabas have come back to Antioch. And in verse 1 of chapter 15, certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." Antioch isn't mentioned, but that's the place where these things are happening. And so now Antioch, with Paul's participation, they kind of return the favor to Jerusalem. They aren't sending teachers to instruct Jerusalem, but now Paul and Barnabas are sent again from Antioch, this time back to Jerusalem, because of the errors that were common in both places. So now we have churches aware of and communicating with each other, or sending teachers for one reason or another, because there are errors that are influencing the brethren in both places. And then one other example in Acts chapter 18 and verse 27. Acts chapter 18 and verse 27. Here Apollos has been taught by Aquila and Priscilla, and he was persuaded, he was convinced. And when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. So here churches are communicating because of someone that they have in common. The church there in Ephesus came to know Apollos well enough that they could commend him to the brethren to whom he went in the area of Achaia. So again, notice the kind of the communication, the interest. Those who are in Antioch, well, their eyes are primarily focused on each other and the community there, but not exclusively focused there. And the church in Jerusalem, there's work to do in Jerusalem among themselves and among the lost. And so naturally that gets their primary attention, but not their exclusive attention. They are aware of and looking for ways to encourage others that they know of. Then also notice the kind of work the churches are doing and the kind of teachers that they are sending. Paul goes out from Antioch in Acts chapter 13. What kind of a message is he teaching from place to place? say obviously the gospel, but Paul knew other messages. Paul was skilled as a tent maker, but he didn't go from place to place providing opportunities for the brethren to learn how to make tents and for the church to have a tent-making ministry, as it might be called today. They went out teaching the gospel, matters of spiritual maturity, teaching people to work with their own hands and to mind their own business, but not providing job training of that sort. They were teaching the kind of knowledge and wisdom that God revealed. And then also notice that churches can work together or cooperate, but none of this involved one church taking oversight of the other churches. The church in Jerusalem in Acts 11 could send Barnabas to Antioch, but Antioch would have the right to say, well, we have some question or uncertainty, we're not ready to receive him. Every congregation would have that right. There were no organizational associations. There were no regional overseers or any structure such as that sometimes today might be called denominationalism. There wasn't any of that. Those practices today just reveal that God had a plan for not only the fact that churches would work together, but how they would work together. There was a way for them to cooperate. There was a way for them to work together without one working over the other. But that's so assumed in our society today. Many people have never thought about it. The well-known Catholic hierarchy, and then many Protestant groups have various structures that they have formed. And the result of that is that the church ends up becoming a fundraiser for these other organizations and structures and levels that man has created. There's not a hint of that anywhere. In fact, what we read in 2 Corinthians 11, those churches, they did not send their funds to Corinth for Corinth to decide how to distribute. They sent their funds to Paul. And that's consistent in the New Testament. Today, men have also added a variety of other works. Churches sponsoring recreational camps, sport camps, public education. And so the church providing math training, science training, and other things. Today, or what we're reading in Scripture is the churches are working together, but what are they doing? That's significant, just as significant that they work together in some way. And so today we can still do that same kind of work. We can send evangelists, and I hope you think of it that way when I go on occasions such as I did. We receive evangelists, and so we, from year to year, twice a year, that's what we're doing. I don't think we view that as a business transaction, and I hope more and more we can think of it in this way, of those whom we invite, those whom we receive. Well, they are sent by someone. It's the same kind of work as what we're reading here in the book of Acts. And so my absence and required others here do additional work. Well, that didn't. What's the fruit? What's the result of that? Well, in part, it can of course help those who do that work here, but then also another way to view that is if that offers some opportunity for Christians in other places, for another church, well then that's an additional motivation and reason for that. And so this is just the natural result of the plan that God originated, not for churches to become the tool or the servant of man-made religion, but for churches to be the tool of God's religion. And so when churches are working together, God is working. One other aspect is that God is working when saints are working privately. There's some things, there's some decisions that the church doesn't need to plan, that the church doesn't need to oversee. There's some things that need to happen that do not involve the church. Look at Acts chapter 2 and verse 46. We read about saints working together privately. Here, among the earliest details that are given of what this new life was like for those who were given life in Christ as a result of the gospel being spread on the day of Pentecost and every day thereafter. In Acts chapter 2, verse 46, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. Now the first part involved the entire church, that they were meeting daily with one accord, with one mind. So that was a group type of decision. But being together, breaking bread from house to house, the apostles were not assigning, well, you've got to have people in your house and you've got to have it this time. That's just what we call hospitality. This was people who lived in Jerusalem, recognized that there were some who were not from Jerusalem, and so they provided a home for them, whether this was for an afternoon or whether it was on a temporarily ongoing basis. Is God working when Christians are together from house to house? Well, what this says in verse 47 is that they were praising God in their homes. But then what was the result at the end of verse 47? I didn't read that. But the result of them being together from house to house, a part of that is that the gospel was being spread. I think you can fill in the blanks. What was happening from house to house, in addition to them meeting daily at the temple, whatever those activities were, in part it resulted in the gospel being spread to new individuals day by day. In Acts chapter 20, because Paul had spent several years in Ephesus spreading the gospel, now as he's on another errand, another work, in verse 17, from Miletus, he sent to Ephesus and called for the elders of the church. Again, this isn't something where all the congregation is involved. This is just a private meeting because of the time that Paul had spent with them, and he describes that in verse 20, that his time in Ephesus involved work that was public. And in the same wording even that's there in verse 4 that we read in Acts 2:46, he says, you also know of the work that I did from house to house. So here are just saints together privately, but those are also opportunities that can be of encouragement and edification. And then go to Romans chapter 16. Romans chapter 16 is a little bit unusual in the New Testament. There are other passages that are similar, but not to the depth and length of this. Romans chapter 16, beginning in verse 1 and going down to verse 15. I'm not going to read it, but I don't think it takes you long if you just skim over that. What Paul does here is just list a series of names of people who were in Rome, and without giving details, he had met these people in various places and in various times, but now they're in Rome. And so he commends them in different ways. But for just a moment, think about how did Paul know them? How did Paul know these people? Well, in verse 1, he mentions Phoebe, and he says that she had been a helper, the end of verse 2, that she's been a helper of many and of myself also. She had served him some time, some place, in some way. What about verse 3? Greet Priscilla and Aquila. We know about them back from Acts chapter 18. They also were tent makers, and so Paul worked with them. And so all of the people that he named here were, for the majority of them, we don't know anything about them anywhere else. But what it says is that Paul had worked with them in some especially personal or private way, and yet that was so meaningful to him and left such a mark on him that when he wrote to the church in Rome, and as he knew that they were there, then he sent greetings to them. Today we don't know all of those details, but maybe one lesson that comes from that list of names is just that the Lord knows those who are His. These are not names that are preserved in man's record of history, but these were average people like you and I, And God noticed their work, and God knew that they were His. And Paul records their name also because of the time that he had spent with them in the past. Let me take a few minutes to mention something similar to that. In the 2 weeks that we spent a couple days in San Diego, and our main reason for going there was not the sun and the warmth, though that was nice. Main reason I thought of going there, once the church in Tucson had invited us to visit them, there's a widow living there who lives on Social Security, but I think it's through her knowledge of my dad's work in the Philippines. When she heard that my family was moving here, she wanted to help us be able to live here. For 5 years, a widow, she didn't have a wealthy husband who left her a fortune, a 90-year-old widow living on Social Security has sent some money to my family every month so that we can be here doing the work of the gospel. I had never met her. I don't think my parents have either. So when I was going to be in the region, I wanted to meet her. I wanted my children to meet her. And she's someone that I would imagine would fit the kind of people mentioned in Romans chapter 16. While we were there, she mentioned a friend of hers who is also a Christian there, who is 106 years old. And just within the past months, maybe the past year, she's been homebound, but till she was 105, she wasn't. But she's been losing her eyesight and her hearing to some degree, so she's rarely able to get out. We went by just to visit her for a few minutes, but before we left, she went over to Starla and said, well, there's a lady that comes to help take care of me, and I think I'm going to be able to have an opportunity to have a Bible study with her. Will you pray for her and pray for me? That's the kind of Christian that I imagine is mentioned like these in Romans chapter 16. So we got to do some other pleasant things in San Diego, but meeting two Christians like this, that was among the reasons that we went. Then we took a little road trip. Won't bore you with those details, but when we arrived in Tucson, some of you might remember Brendan Ashby has visited us a couple times, and he's doing the work of an evangelist there. While there, I learned that the church there had been meeting since the late 50s, and so about the same as this church. But they have had elders. They had elders from the time they began, and they have had elders continually since then. They've never not had elders. And I've never heard of a church. I've been among churches that had elders, but I've never even heard of a church that has had elders for, I said, about 70 years without any interruption in that. While there, we had some time, of course, to visit with a few different families. One family had a 2-year-old daughter, died 2 or 3 years ago. Met a 70-year-old woman who learned the gospel just a few years ago, and in just visiting with her just briefly after worship, she described she had tried just about every world religion. I can't even remember them all because she just listed one after the other. She had been atheist and agnostic, and then she even mentioned Wicca and just the whole spectrum in and out of it. And around the age of 70, let me also add, she even had been to seminary. So she had gone to some religious group's official preaching school, so to speak. But at 70 years old, when she heard and learned the gospel, she recognized it, and she's still young in the faith. We met a young woman who uses a cane and sometimes even a walker because of some health issues. But this young woman not only helps in teaching the children's classes, but every Sunday afternoon before the evening assembly, she teaches a Bible drill class, kind of like the one that I do just once a month. She does it every single week in addition to some other things while wrestling with various health problems. We met a mother who had 2 young children. Her husband left her 3 years ago, he was a Christian, but he left her, I think, for another woman. But here this mother is trying to teach her children, but she talked about trying to learn how to teach her co-workers. She's also teaching children's classes and attentive in a variety of ways. And then the ladies there have a class. I forget how frequently they meet. Starla could tell you those details, but they were engaged in a study of how to teach the lost. And so their idea was not, well, leave that up to the elders, leave that up to the preacher, leave that up to the deacons. They were focused on that. And then I mentioned Brendan Ashby. He's a maturing evangelist, whom I met when I lived in Oregon. Might even ask the question, can any good thing come out of Oregon? But this is a good maturing young man. So my point of that is just akin to Paul's purposes in Romans chapter 16. He sent greetings to these, and there are people that I described there. I could go somewhere else, and I could say some similar things about the church here. Your ups and your downs privately and personally. And the point is that God is working when saints work together, know each other, and that God is attentive and God sees that work and the struggle and the growth. Last, let's look at Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 16. God gets the credit. God gets the honor. God certainly deserves our attention, and God deserves our worship for a host of reasons. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 16, God is also working when every part does its share. Connecting this to the previous point, every part is different. Every part has its own unique struggles. Every part has its own unique strengths. Every part has its own unique purpose. And God doesn't elevate one over the other. We're back in Ephesians 4, we read earlier, verses 11 and 12. God doesn't elevate the apostle, the prophet, the evangelist, the pastor and teacher, or the saint. God doesn't elevate one over the other, because when each part does its share, then read with me, verse 16, Christ is the head, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. God doesn't elevate any part. We certainly ought not either, because they each strengthen the body in a way that the other part doesn't and really can't. When every part does its share, God is working. God's the one who made that part, included that part, added that part to the body. God is the one who gives the purpose and the work and the focus to that part. And so in the work that we do, while we're all parts of different kinds of groups, we're parts of different families, we're part of maybe some workplace, maybe part of some private club or organization that is focused on something we appreciate or that we enjoy. But everything that I've mentioned, our family, our workplace, those groups, one day our connection and our association to them is going to be over. But the Lord's people are a part of a group. What ties us together is going to continue. And so let's do our share. And when we do our share, that honor is credited to God. In Revelation chapter 2 and 3, not only is each individual part working together, in Revelation 2 and 3, we read about the 7 churches, and there God also is not elevating one church over another. If we did a little bit of study of the different cities in which these saints lived, well, there would have been different. Maybe some would have been more urban, some more rural, and maybe even Fairbanks doesn't really fit those. Just remote, maybe is the best word for that. You would have had large churches, smaller churches, the same kind of variety that we see today. But in Revelation 2 and 3, no church is compared to another church. They are all searched out by their head, and Jesus is looking at them to see, well, who is faithful, who is sound, who is healthy, who is what they ought to be, not by comparison to some other, but just based on what they have, who is what they ought to be. And then Jesus offered help to those who are what they ought to be. And then Jesus offered to help those 5 out of the 7 who were not what they ought to be. But the message of Revelation 2 and 3 is the Lord knows all of the churches who are His, and He searches the churches to see, is every part doing its share? And then He's not just doing that for observation, He's offering to help every part. He's offering to help every church. And so that of course hasn't changed. God has not changed. Jesus is still doing exactly what is presented in that vision to John in Revelation, the end of chapter 1, and into chapters 2 and 3. The Church of Christ in Santee, California, the San Diego area, they face challenges. You might think, I'd love to live there. The weather is great. Well, the weather is great, but they have to pay thousands of dollars just to rent the place that they meet. And they weren't complaining, but just saying it's not really ideal, but it's the best that's available. Of course, they're struggling with the typical culture in California. And then I've even heard of this in the news, maybe you have, of people moving from California. Well, some of those people are Christians who are moving, and we can understand that, but that's a struggle if you're a part of a church and families are moving, those connections being weakened in some ways. But God sees that is the message of Revelation 2 and 3. The church in Tucson has had elders uninterrupted since the 50s. Previous to Brendan, there was an evangelist there who had been there for 30 years. And they're maybe around 100 or 120 in number, and so they are willing to help me to be here, and then I'm not the only one. They're helping several evangelists. And so their work is unique in some ways. And Revelation 2 and 3 would remind us that God also sees the church here. How does He assess us? How do you assess us? What are our challenges? What are our strengths? What are our opportunities? What are our weaknesses? We need to try to see these because God sees these and offers to help us in all of those. And when every part does its share, then that doesn't make us anybody in the eyes of the world. It doesn't make us more or lesser than any other of His churches. What we're trying to do is do our share, and God is working when we'll do our share. Sometimes it's easy for me to maybe go away and do the work there, then come back and then get focused on the work we're doing here. And that's appropriate to some degree, but I hope it's helpful to know about the fellowship that we share, even on the rare occasions when I have opportunities to go and work with God and God's people in other places. Thank you for sending me. If my work was fruitful or beneficial in some way there, then I hope you view it as sharing in that work without knowing the faces and the names and the details. I distinctly remember moving here just almost exactly 5 years ago because my dad knew of the church here, and then coming to visit and just seeing a mind to be willing to work. That was high among the reasons that my family is here. And so that's the goal, and that's our purpose. And we sing a variety of songs about that. Let's turn our minds to song number 287. God is working today. Many people don't understand that. Many people ignore it. But God is working today. And let's determine for today, and if God gives us a tomorrow, to be busy working, knowing that God will be working in us. God is working. If there's anyone who is here and recognizes your sin by faith in the working of God, if you'll confess your faith, then you can be baptized. In Colossians 2:12, Paul used that language, that we are buried with Christ when we are baptized by faith in the working of God. If you need His work, if you need His help of forgiveness, as a Christian, if you need to return to Him, He will work, He will help. And if we are walking in the light, if we are living in Christ, it's not our ideas, it's not our holiness, it's what God is working in us. Let's sing this song with that faith and that trust. And if we can help anyone this morning in any way, please tell us how as we stand together and sing to Him.